Thank you.
Over to you.
Thanks, Audrey. I am a Canadian-trained lawyer and researcher. My work focuses on Indigenous state relations and Indigenous rights, and I recently completed an LLM in the Polar Law program here at the University of Akureyri. On my talk, We Are Caribou People, Gwich'in Rights and Responsibilities to the Porcupine Caribou Herd, is based on my master's thesis research, in which I applied a legal lens to the relationship between the Gwich'in Indigenous people of the Western North American Arctic and the caribou that have sustained them for millennia. So this is quite a pivot from our previous presenter, and I think quite different in kind as well from our last talk of this session, but there's wonderful breadth in the work that gets done at this university. So you're all along for the ride. I'll begin with a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll begin with a brief discussion of Gwich'in-caribou relations, which are characterized by mutual reliance and caregiving responsibilities that have important legal dimensions. I'll briefly touch on some of the external forces that have complicated Gwich'in-caribou relations. These include various forms of state-based interference with Gwich'in lifeways, as well as the growing impact of climate change. Then I'll discuss the Gwich'in Nation's ongoing fight to protect the porcupine caribou herd's calving ground from fossil fuel development, which has been a persistent threat since the 1980s, and it's become particularly dire in the Trump era. Finally, I will discuss briefly the promise and limits of international law as part of the toolkit that Gwich'in are using to defend the calving ground and may choose to use in the future. I'll touch on the shortcomings of the conservation treaty that is supposed to be protecting this herd. And finally, I'll talk briefly about international human rights law, which may be a bit more useful to Gwich'in despite having its own significant limitations. Gwich'in and caribou have lived together on the northwestern fringe of North America since time immemorial, and they have cared for and relied on each other throughout that time. In the words of Gwich'in elder Sarah James, quote, "Caribou are not just what we eat, they are who we are. They are in our stories and songs and the whole way we see the world. Caribou are our life. Without caribou, we wouldn't exist." So you can see here that caribou are so central to Gwich'in identity that they are certainly central to Gwich'in culture, and Gwich'in call themselves caribou people, hence the title of my talk. And Gwich'in and caribou remain deeply connected to each other despite 2 centuries of state interference with Gwich'in lifeways, and particularly with Gwich'in mobility and access to the herd, both individual members of the herd that sustain Gwich'in on a material level, and the herd as a whole, which Gwich'in are responsible for caring for. I'll discuss that a little bit more in a moment. Under Gwich'in law, which has always existed and continues to exist despite the imposition of other legal systems on the territory, Gwich'in have an ongoing responsibility to protect the herd and its habitat. They also have a responsibility to treat individual caribou with respect, and that includes hunting in a respectful way, sharing the meat that results from those hunts, and in particular ensuring that nothing is wasted, which would be disrespectful to the life that has been taken. And this agreement to care for each other stems from an ancient interspecies treaty. Many Gwich'in describe their relationship with caribou as dating back to the beginning of time, and being based on an agreement to care for each other that was reached when they switched places in order to build mutual respect and benefit from each other's traits. There's lots more I could say about that, but I am cognizant of time, so I'm happy to take questions later. In the words of Gwich'in lawyer Chris Statnick, this story of treaty plays an important role in, quote, reaffirming the special legal relationship between the Gwich'in and the caribou. And so I would argue that these responsibilities continue despite the impact of external forces on Gwich'in lifeways. Those external forces include the US-Canada border that runs right through the heart of Gwich'in territory and the porcupine caribou herd's range, which has really complicated their relationship for more than a century now. Border enforcement has constrained cross-border hunting, food sharing, and kinship ties among Gwich'in. The existence of the border itself has provided a basis for both the US and Canada to impose their own laws on Gwich'in and caribou. And state-based laws have facilitated disruptive exploitation of both renewable and non-renewable resources in the herd's habitat, while limiting how Gwich'in themselves can use the natural wealth of their own territory. And furthermore, climate change is already disrupting caribou migration routes and further complicating Gwich'in-caribou relations. Overgrowth and rapid forestation with warming is impeding the herd's movement and its access to food, while unpredictable freeze-melt cycles are making it more dangerous for both Gwich'in and caribou to move through the territory. In some instances, large numbers of caribou calves have drowned in swollen rivers, after being born in the wrong place due to adverse weather conditions that prevented their mothers from reaching the optimal calving ground on the northern coast of the territory, which will be the focus of the remainder of my talk. To help you envision the spatial relationships that are at work here, I'm briefly going to touch on a map prepared by the Gwich'in Steering Committee. It provides a cartographic argument for the interconnectedness between Gwich'in culture and the caribou. Those two reddish-brown polygons you can see show the extensive overlap between Gwich'in territory and the primary habitat of the Porcupine Caribou herd. The lighter orange one is the Gwich'in, the darker brown one is the caribou. You can also see here how the border cuts through the heart of Gwich'in territory and herd habitat. And the red area at the top of the map is the coastal calving ground, which provides optimal conditions for the herd's continued survival and is unfortunately under threat of fossil fuel development. This has been a threat since the 1980s. In 1988, the Gwich'in gathered from both sides of the border to launch an ongoing fight to protect the calving ground from fossil fuel development, which the US Republican Party in particular have been pushing since the 80s. This land is part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but the US Congress hasn't given it a permanent wilderness designation, so it is vulnerable to this type of development threat. Gwich'in call it Itzak Watsan Gandai Gudlit, which is the sacred place where life begins. So it's essential to their material well-being and their culture, but it also has spiritual significance to the Gwich'in, which is relevant when we come to the international human rights piece of this issue. Drilling in the calving ground really represents an existential threat both to the caribou and to the Gwich'in culture, and more broadly contributes to the existential threat of climate change, which is causing such destruction around the world already. Gwich'in have forged a diverse coalition of conscience with environmentalists, religious groups, and others over the last 4 decades as they fight to protect this land. And Canada-based Gwich'in have been an integral part of those efforts. They often have just as much at stake as their US counterparts, but US officials tend to ignore them to an even greater extent than they ignore the Alaska-based Gwich'in because they're not seen as being legitimate stakeholders, even though the border through their territory is a state construct that was imposed upon them without their consent and really makes no sense from an ecological perspective. In the Trump era, things have gotten worse. Since Trump first took office, there's been legislation that requires a series of lease sales for fossil fuel leasing to occur within the calving ground area, which is believed to have significant oil and gas resources. The first lease sale took place just before Trump left office the first time, and the Biden administration was able to cancel those leases, but had to continue with a second lease sale because the law that required it had not been repealed by the US Congress. They were able to update the environmental impact statement to try to really limit the scope of destruction that would flow from this type of leasing, but they did have to go ahead with a second lease sale to offer the prospect of drilling leases in this area. Gwich'in were really relieved earlier this year when no bids were received in that lease sale that took place just before Trump returned to office. But unfortunately, in the past 3.5, has it only been 3 months? In the past 3 months, the Trump administration has really pushed ahead with this determination to maximize the scope of development in this area rather than minimizing the impact that development would have on caribou and Gwich'in. They started with an executive order, followed by a policy change at the Department of Interior. And last month, they had a court victory. A court found that the cancellation of the leases that the Biden administration had achieved was not legitimate and is not allowed to stand. So those leases are back in force, and it remains to be seen what's going to happen next. But the Gwich'in have been fighting this for 40 years nearly, and they're going to keep on fighting on every level to protect this sacred space and the birthing grounds of this keystone species on which they are so dependent and to whom they have so many responsibilities. And they're using every tool available to them and have committed to continue doing so, and that includes international law. There is a treaty, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, a conservation treaty between the US and Canada that is specifically designed to protect this herd. It dates back to 1987, and it states that states should avoid or minimize activities that would significantly disrupt the herd's behavior or otherwise lessen its usability to the humans who rely on it. So this isn't about the rights of the caribou. This is about the rights of the people who rely on the caribou. And the obligations in the treaty are owed between US and Canada to each other, not to anyone else, which imposes certain limitations on how useful it can be. Structurally, though, it has a lot of other shortcomings. It's proven to be pretty toothless. States are supposed to notify and consult each other in certain circumstances. Sometimes that's not until harm to the herd has actually been done, which is not very helpful. And moreover, there are no consequences if they fail to notify and consult when they're supposed to. And the US has thus far failed to consult and notify when it's supposed to, when threatening harm to this herd. Moreover, the US has essentially hamstrung the body on multiple occasions by refusing to appoint members, so it can't reach quorum, or refusing to consent through its representatives to any recommendations that the Canadian side of the board proposes. So it really hasn't been very useful, and it's unlikely to help Gwich'in much in this particular fight. However, there is perhaps more promise on the international human rights law side. International human rights law, as most of you know, protects everyone, guarantees certain inalienable rights to all individuals in the world. But some international human rights law treaties also have specific provisions that protect group rights to culture, for instance. These are particularly significant for Indigenous peoples, and the content of those rights, what they mean in practice on the ground, or what they should mean in practice, has really been fleshed out by a series of international treaty bodies that have interpreted the language of the treaties in question. Sometimes there's a treaty that spells out the obligations that all the states that opt into the treaty have to the people in their jurisdiction. And then sometimes there will be a separate complaint process that lets individual people complain about specific violations. So state X has done Y to me, and it's violated my rights under the treaty in these ways. But those are often two separate opt-ins. So a state may opt into the first, the obligations writ large, but not necessarily the second. Some of these processes are slow and a bit more thorough. Other processes are a bit quicker and therefore have less scope to deal with the meat of an issue. The Gwich'in to date have used some of the more expedited processes, or have tried to do so. During the first Trump administration, they initiated a couple of very expedited international human rights law processes. They didn't get very far with those. The most successful one was a submission to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The most they got out of that was the committee asking the Trump administration some very pointed questions in a series of letters, which the Trump administration largely ignored. So not hugely successful, although certainly Gwich'in made as much hay out of it as they could in terms of pointing to the pointed questions that had been asked. And I would argue that some of the slower international human rights mechanisms may be of more strategic value in this or similar situations, because they deal with the issues at play much more holistically and in much greater depth, and they can produce valuable corroboration that specific wrongdoing has occurred if the relevant state has opted into the mechanism that lets the treaty body look at the specific situation. So the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is an Americas-wide body, does have a petition procedure that is, in theory, available to Gwich'in. They could use this to challenge the way the US has treated the calving ground and is treating the calving ground. In the past, the instrument that the petition process interprets, which does bind the US, has been used to find that a state elsewhere in the Americas violated Indigenous group rights by issuing oil concessions on traditional lands without getting the prior consent of the affected Indigenous people. So very squarely the type of issue that the Gwich'in are facing here. But it's a very slow process, which I'll return to in a moment. There are equivalent UN processes, and there's a lot of law that's been developed explaining exactly what those rights, in particular the right to culture under the ICCPR, mean for Indigenous peoples. But those corresponding processes for scrutinizing the specific content of states aren't available to the Gwich'in with grievances against the US. Because although the US has opted into the treaty and is supposed to be following it, it hasn't opted in to the corresponding complaint mechanisms. So those bodies are unable to say the US has violated the treaty in these ways. However, Gwich'in are free to use that language themselves and look to the other views and output of these bodies in analogous circumstances to say, hey, this is just like another situation where the treaty body said this. So the US is just the same in violating our rights. Of course, that has less clout than a UN body would have in the public imagination. So there is some significant limitation, and this stems from the opt-in nature of, and kind of piecemeal opt-in nature of international human rights law. That being said, The Gwich'in are going to keep fighting this. They're not going to stop at the 11th hour just because things are looking particularly dire. And even if the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights petition process doesn't end up being fast enough to save the calving ground, if drilling proceeds before a petition filed tomorrow could actually be heard in its substance, I think there's still strategic value in that, and that's something that Gwich'in may choose to pursue in the future, if nothing else, as a recognition from the world that a great injustice has been done. I look forward to your questions.